Hi, welcome to another episode of Straight from the Desk. In this episode, we will paint the fantastic new Katakros model from Games Workshop. Katakros is the Montag of the Necropolis, and he's a part of the new army for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I really like the sculpt. I think the sculpt is somewhat special. If you look at other sculpts from Games Workshop, this here looks a lot more natural. It's super fine detailed, and it has really nice gravity to it. This is something that you really rarely see in models, is that you actually feel that they are not like zero gravity creatures, but there is some gravity to it. So here in this example, I think it's really fantastic how the hip is posed together with, like, you almost feel the weight of the cloak that he's wearing. I really like the sculpt also from the back and the details there, so I decided to do a little conversion where I actually get rid of that heavy cloak. So I have the back a little bit more exposed, and you can see here on the pictures of the conversion I've added a different kind of cloak. And I also set off the details on the shield because I wanted to have a more clean look to that and not so full of ornaments. And you can see also on the back is quite a bit more exposed, and we can see that fine detail sculpt. So for the paint job, we will focus on creating that nice bone armor in the first part of the video. So for the placement of highlights, it's really important to pay attention to the shapes that we find. So if we have a look here on the model, we first have that bare model. And if we start to reduce the shape to like a super simple shape, we only have the cylindric shape that always lead to a highlight in the front or at the top of the cylinder. So if we zoom in a little and take a look at the more detailed volumes and shapes that we find on the model, you can see that we have the cylinders. We have also cones, which are kind of like a cylinder from the placement of highlights. We also have clearly visible spheres, and we have more oval shapes. Regarding the placement of highlight is, because we have a center light situation, we want to have the same shape of the highlight than we have for the object, but place that on the top of each of these volumes. So in the paint job, you can see how we tried to combine actually both of that. We tried to combine the first general highlight to the front of each of the cylinders and overlay that, so to say, with these small detail highlights. Alright, let's see how that looks on the model.
Okay, so here we are with the primed model. I first used cast black out of the can, and once that was dry, I've hit it with some red bone, also from Games Workshop, also out of the rattle can, and I hit it from the top, and as you can see I used plenty of it, which gives us quite a nice shadow and highlight definition, and we can already read the highlights really well. So we're going for quite a bit more colorful version than we have in the official box art. And yeah, I really like the new design. As I said, it's really quite special. You have that gravity, and it has something really classical from the sculpt. It's almost something like a fantasy version of David from Michelangelo. As I said, we're going for a bit more colors. If you have a look in the palette, we have some Schmincke Titanium White. Here we have some of the Privateer Press Rucksack Tan. Here we have some Carbon Black from Chimera. Here we have some contrast paints. Here we have the Wildwood. Here we have the Flesh Tears Red. And here we have some of the Storm Shield Medium. It's a little hard to see, but here we have some of the model color Turquoise, which is quite a bit better to see. Alright. Let's start with a bit of like a darker red tone that we need for some of the crevices, and we're mixing that from some of the Wildwood and plenty of the fleshiest red. Cleaning the brush and picking that up here just in the tip, and we're working with something between a light layer and a heavy glaze consistency. So we're working with that heavy glaze, and we're starting to apply that here for that inner structure. And yeah, I want to do that now in the beginning, because as you can see in this stage it's quite easy to stain the surface, and we can just clean that up later on with our work on these outer plates. This also saves us some time because we're going for a rather clean look, and this way we don't have to do like a retouchment of all these areas later on. I want to add that red here into the deeper layer of those armor plates, and I think it's really nice because it gives it an almost organic look to it. You have that feel of flesh, and I like that combination with the bone colors because that gives us almost like the look of like in one of those old-fashioned anatomy posters where you have these nice red tones for the muscles, these whiter colors for all the tendons, and these light blue colors as well. So that will also be one inspiration for our overall color scheme, and I like that separation with the two tones for the armor because it gives us quite a bit more variety than just the one colored, almost monochrome look that we find in the box art. So we're just doing that step here to the upper part of the torso. We don't need to do that over the whole model. As most of you know how I work bit by bit. And I will continue with a little of the Rucksack 10 here. And you can see it's that nice yellow ochre tone. And we're adding a bit of white to get like a paler tone. And we're also adding a tiny bit of the carbon black to gray it down a bit, because the Rucksack 10 itself is actually quite yellow. And we're working it with a somewhat heavy glaze consistency, and you can really see nicely actually how I try to drag the pigments over the surface, leaving an equal film of paint. So we're trying to do that really in quite a controlled manner, and so the paint is not pooling in the recesses. So we're applying like one or two coats of that glaze just to tint the surface, and this way we still preserve a little bit of that nice 2K foundation that we did. And you can see here, because the paint is quite thin, that the areas where we actually hid it with our darker contrast color is still visible, and we will need a little bit more opaque paint to actually cover those areas. And yeah, I like the look of that layer here with the glaze consistency color. It's really nice to see how you can actually quite controlled tint in area with still preserving that pre-shaded surface. And yeah, I think you can see like we're just having about 10 minutes of painting work in. We already have like quite an interesting result, and we'll continue with a little bit more of that base color here in a thicker consistency, so we can cover up the areas where we spilled over with the red. And you can see this covers those stains already quite a bit better. And it's also already a little bit darker, so I'm applying that also here again to more like these shadow areas here on the larger muscles. One thing that you have to take care of actually when you use that 2K foundation, especially using rattle cans, but sometimes also with the airbrush, is that you really make sure that you clean up the grain also in the shadow areas, because this tends to leave like kind of like a noisy look, and it's hard to get like a really crisp and clean paint job if you have like the grain still visible in those areas. Okay, I will just continue applying a second coat of the base color, and we'll be back to do some highlight work. All right. Okay, you can see I've continued with a second layer of the base color, and we're continuing with a little bit of that wildwood, and we're applying that here to these crevices that separate the armor. We're doing that as controlled as possible to not really stain the surface all too much, but we're also doing that relatively early in the process, so we can just correct that during our highlighting stage. We're also sketching in a bit of our maximum shadow color here under the breast muscles, and we're continuing a little in a speed up, just filling up the other super dark crevices using the wildwood contrast paint. Okay, I like the look of that. Cleaning the brush, and this stage now is just perfect to continue with our highlighting work in that area. And we're doing our first steps all with a loaded brush, just to get like these super strong contrasted elements done. And we're doing that with some of the thinned down base color in the back of the brush and some titanium white. And we're starting to introduce the highlight here on that large oval shape of the breast muscle. And you can see I'm placing the little brush down, first softening it out to the lower side, and then continuing like with very gentle movement of the brush to push it also upwards to the upper area. We're continuing, just loading up our brush again with pure titanium white to the tip, and we're actually first placing it because we had plenty of it on the tip of the brush, and we're first placing it on these raised elements, and then continuing to use like more mixed tone and blending it on the surface. And actually you can see that you have more time than you usually think to blend the color still on the surface. And we're also continuing that highlight line here also on the other side of the breast. And you remember when we discussed the shapes and the placement of highlight in the beginning of the video, we defined those oval shapes here in the breast muscle. We're trying to emulate the same look here on both sides. And the same counts actually also here for these wonderful small oval volumes to the side of the torso. And we're trying to define like a nice semi-glossy material here with these strong individual highlights for the individual volumes. We're continuing with a loaded brush with like thinner paint in the back of the brush and white just on the tip. Also for these small volumes here to the lower side. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we can show off that here also in a speed up, because all that we're trying to do here is just place those strong, sharp highlights with the loaded brush. And here we're really trying to force that center to light situation with the strong highlights following the shape of the object from the top and soft those out accordingly. So in speed up you can also see that some of the highlights that we're placing now are quite rough, especially here also to the lower side with these elements, but we're trying to refine the placement of highlights and the blending on the surface bit by bit, shaping out these small details and lines also on the other parts here on the lower part of the torso, of the, so to say, stomach muscles here to the lower side. And we haven't actually started softening out our shadows or creating like stronger midtones or color variation, but you can see that this step here in the beginning where we actually place our strong highlights is already really defining the surface and gives us like that dramatic impact of light that we're going for. So here we can already see like that combination of the first cylindric shape that we've spotted and the combination with those small highlights. And you can see that here at this stage where we actually use just the lowered brush, we already have a very intense look. And yeah, in the next step we're going to soft out like these strongest shadows that we sketched in, and we will do that using a bit of the wildwood and mix that with our base color to get like also a color that is somewhat between heavy and medium glaze tone consistency. And we're using that to soft out the areas here between our core shadows and the more mid-tony area. We want to keep the shadows here to the lower side of the breast muscle really short. And we're continuing here, creating a mixed tone that is a little bit more opaque than before. And yeah, that already works quite a bit better, and we're using that between medium and heavy glaze color here to soft out our breast muscle and to intensify the shadow. We're adding the shadow to both sides of the breast muscle in like the same intensity, and we're also using the same color here under these small raised bits to the side. We're also using the glaze now at that stage where there is not so much left in the brush, just to detail out these small lumps here in the middle, and we're also continuing here a bit on the breast muscle. And we're using that here to get those small muscles on the rib cage worked out a bit more here, with also adding like not the strongest shadow that we had before, but just like one of the mid-tones that we've used here. And we're remixing a bit of our base tone here, using some of the P3 Rucksack 10 and some black. That was a little bit too much black. More of the P3 Rucksack 10 and more of the white to get a color that is somewhat close to our base color that we've been using before. Cleaning the brush. And also mixing like a thinner glaze here to the side. And yeah, we needed to remix that base tone here because we were way too much in the beginning to already run out of our base color. And yeah, color-wise we can see it works just fine. And we can use that slightly thicker version of our base color here to re-establish the mid-tone a bit and to soft out the shadow glazes that we've just applied. And I'm continuing again with small little brushes, just having the same color in the back of the brush, some white on the tip, placing it here on the surface and pushing it along that nice looking crack here in the center of our breast muscle. Just picking up some white to push the contrast of our main highlight here on the breast muscle again a bit, because we really want to focus like the center of that oval highlight here also to the upper area of our breast muscle. And we're balancing that on both sides and trying to keep it in like the same value here. And we're continuing here with the loaded brush to also get like a little bit of those dramatic highlights here to the lower side of the stomach muscles that you can just see peeking out over the sash. I'm already at that stage trying to work out like the different shapes that we find, so that lower raised corner and also the upper area here of those stomach muscles. I'm always saying muscles, but it's more like the muscle bone hybrid texture or surface that we find. But as those shapes really remind of like the muscles they're inspired from, forgive me if I say muscles. So we're just continuing here with loaded brushes to get like an equal intensity to both sides of the torso, and we're really trying to focus that slightly stronger highlights to the center of that cylindric volume that we've like spotted in the first place. And I think the armor really offers a lot of different surfaces with those nice rounder volumes, and we really have like such a diversity here in shapes that we really rarely have with like the Games Workshop models, and it's something that is really nice to work with, also to play a little bit around with like the potential of the loaded brush, because you can really use it very versatile depending on how you actually pull it on the surface. And you can see like it often leaves like a somewhat brighter mid-tone. So I'm going back in there, re-establishing like that super strong bright highlight, and then just softening it out minimally to the sides of the object. So sometimes for a loader brush you have to go back to an area multiple times until it's perfect. And this way you have the opportunity to combine like longer transitions and smoother blends with more abrupt, strong highlights. Also something that you will see actually quite often when you observe how I use the loader brush is that I'm just placing my strong white highlights first, because I have like quite a bit on the surface, and then once I feel like it slowly starts to mix a bit more on the tip, I can just dab like around that to blend these out minimally. So I think I really like the look already, but we will continue here with our loaded brushes. Just try to really pay attention to the shapes that we find. So yeah, I like the look of that. There is definitely like still a bit to do here, and we will just continue a little with our softening up work. So we'll be back to introduce some color variation. Alright, okay, so here we are, and you can see I just continued a little with softening up work, and I want to continue with a little of that color variation as I said, and we'll do that with some of the model color turquoise here, cleaning the brush and adding some of that pure Rucksack 10 in there. And that gives us quite an interesting greenish shade, and we'll just have water in the back of the brush and like a heavy glaze here on the tip. And we're applying our color variation rather random, but we're starting to apply it in the shadow area. This way we are not staining like the highlights that we've just created, and it's also a little bit easier to correct like if you don't like it all that much. So we're first sketching it in here to like that mid shadow area to both sides, and also to I wouldn't say all the objects, but just a bit here and there to give us like a slightly more interesting look on the surface, and also to reduce that look that it almost appears somewhat golden, because now with these strong highlights and that yellowish tone of the Rucksack 10, it's like easy that it appears like somewhat metallic. So in the end we want to go for more something really like a bone color with an interesting green-blue variation and the red in the shadows. Or not actually the shadows, but more here in the crevices. But I really like what that little addition of a cool tone did to the complexity here of the piece, although it definitely needs some softening out work with intermediate tones. And in the next step we're creating a mixed tone with more of the Rucksack 10 in the mix to create like an intermediate tone of the color that we've been just using and our base tone. We're thinning that down here to the side of our dot of paint here, this way we can always like pick from the consistency that we need. And for that next step, we need more of that color in a glaze-like consistency. So we're picking it here from the side, and we're using that intermediate shade here to soft out the color transition. Okay, and you can see it does not cover really well, so we're grabbing a bit of that thicker paint, and this works actually much better here to soft out our and you can see I'm trying to move the brush always in a direction where I can push the pigments to like the end of my brush movement. So the brush drags the pigments on the surface and they gather more at the end of the brush movement. So the direction of where you pull your brush is really important. And you can see that here also on that larger surface. You can really drag the pigments in the tip of your brush and move them to a spot where you want them to dry. But it's important that you don't have too much of the glaze in the brush so it does not run out and spills the paint on the surface. And this way it would just dry and leave these coffee stain-like marks. We're also creating a mixed tone from our base color and a little less of that previous color to create again like an intermediate shade between the strong green and our base tone. We're using some of that tone together with a bit of white in the tip of the brush to also get like a greenish highlight color here, and I want that highlight situation like to have both colors in there, so that more yellowish color from before, but also a paler green mixed tone. And we're continuing with a bit more white, and we're using that here to get like a very nice strong small transition with those pale light green tones and our main highlight. And I'm using that same kind of mixed tone also on other areas where we have more highlight color going on already. Again, picking up a bit more white to do the same also to the small muscles here in the center of our torso, and also up here in the breast muscle we're introducing a bit more of these paler green tones just in that area before our color variation and the highlight colors flow together. Also here to the other side of the torso, we're doing the same. And I always love actually to see here, and this is quite visible on cam, that if you have a brush with long bristles, you can work with that glaze in the brush, even if it's like not tons of glaze in the brush, for really quite a long time. And yeah, we're playing with, again, like a bit more of that stronger bluish glaze here, and going back and forth with the different tones just to achieve like a harmonious flow of colors. This is again like quite a good example to see like how the direction of the brush stroke really matters. You can really see how I try to use the glaze here to push it into certain areas, or like also the longer I use the brush, the thinner the glaze gets, usually because I have water in the back of the brush, so I can first place it like in the strongest area, and then it kind of naturally drags out a bit. adding again a bit more white to get these pale highlights again. I really like the look so far, but I think it's kind of hard to see where we're going overall from the contrast. So we will just outline the areas here that surround our torso, so the upper metallic areas, and also here to the sash element, just a small outline to have a better grasp of where this is going. And we will do that with plenty of the carbon black and also plenty of the whitewood to have a color that is not just entirely black and very matte, as the Chimera colors are super matte. We'll use that here, and you can see consistency wise it's like also between a light layer and a heavy glaze. So I like to keep the color here a bit thinner, so have a nice flow and it gets really into the recesses. But as you know how that looks, and it's like quite a boring step, we'll just grab the figure and pull it off cam. Okay, this is how the figure looks now, with the elements here to the top blocked out in a darker color, and I've also used the same kind of dark, super dark black brown to add a separation line between the sash and the upper torso. And I have to say, with those elements blocked out, I really like the contrast. For me, looking at it here on cam, the color appears like quite a bit green in the color variation, and I want to knock that down, but we always have to see, like, sometimes it looks slightly different on cam compared to real life, and we have to always check that it actually looks better in real life. Sometimes it's the same with photos. You look at a photo and think like, okay, no, this looks terrible. And then you have to go actually back and see if there is maybe a mistake or something that is a little bit off in the paint job. And it's the same case here. It looked too green on the cam, and indeed in real life it is a little bit too green. So I'm going back in there with like a glaze of our base tone, and I'm carefully applying that in this transition area and those transition areas here between the color variation and our base tone. Yeah, I think that already looks quite a bit better. Actually, it's quite nice to see up here there's like still a little bit of that bone armor peeking through, and we can really just spot that once it's outlined. We can see that this really needs a bit more definition, and we're continuing here with a loaded brush, pushing the highlights first to those small top lumps, and then also here a little bit to the more horizontal surface of the breast muscle. And I'm also working again with a bit more of that pure white in the tip of the brush to establish these strong highlights on the top of each of these small elements. And once that is placed, I'm using the loaded brush to get also a bit of a surface blend done here to the plates to that connect the front torso plate and the back armor, and also to these small plates under the arm. Here also we're trying to find like the right mixture between highlighting the top edge of it and also a highlight that here stretches along the peak of the curve of that little plate, so we have like a nice definition of the shape. also here when we did our outlining work, we went a little bit over the edge, and I want to correct that and also use that opportunity to kind of like alter the shape of the highlight a bit, placing it next to the framing of the gemstone, and pull it a little bit more here to the lower side. Okay, overall I'm really happy with the look. We still need to do a little bit of detailing and softening out work, but I first want to continue here on the arm, one of the legs, the back a little off cam, because this is really like all the same approach. We'll be back to do the second leg together and discuss the placement of highlights and shadows on the other parts. Alright, okay. As you can see, I continued quite a bit, also doing a little bit of refining work to the upper part that we've been painting together. And I've also painted one of the legs, the little part in the middle, the arm, and also on the back. I've also started highlighting that internal structure here, the deeper layer of actually bone material, but I wanted to give it a bit more of that shiny reflective red look. And you can see here on the back I've also continued detailing things out. And here in the upper area, this is actually a part that was additionally sculpted from milliput to get those shoulder blade-like elements. And you can see the texture here on top is more painted in a freehand manner to work out that texture. I would show you how to achieve the very similar look here on that complex shape of the leg. If you have a look on the palette, we have some Schmincke Titanium White. Here we have some of the Privateer Press Rucksack 10. Here we have some Carbon Black from Chimera. Here we have some of the model color Turquoise. Here we have some contrast paints. Here we have the Flesh Tearers Red. And here we have some of the contrast color Wildwood. We have to remix our base tone again, and as you remember we did that from plenty of the P3, Rucksack 10, a bit of white and some black. Again, I fear this was a little bit too much black, so we're adding again a bit more of the P3, Rucksack 10, and also some white. We're cleaning the brush, and we're adding the color just to the tip of the brush. Oh, but you can see there was a little bit too much water on the brush, so just wiping that off and taking a bit more of the opaque paint here, and we're just taking some of that color and we're testing it here on the surface if we're having a somewhat similar color going on. It doesn't need to be 100% the same, because we will have those natural color variations later on. But just looking at this here, this already looks pretty good for our base color. So here on the leg, if we take a closer look, I think this is a super interesting bit because we can see clearly the different volumes on the leg. Overall, we have that cylindric general shape of the leg, but it's subtracted with little volumes. So here we have that teardrop shape, and over here we have another teardrop shape, and here it's a little bit more like an oval shape. And we're trying to get the same shapes rendered out in our highlights, as you can also see it here on the other leg. So here the highlight is clearly also like a teardrop, and here, for example, where we have more of these sphere-like shapes, we also have a sphere-like volume in the highlight. So we will start here with the upper part, also working with a little bit thinner color here from the side, together with some of the white here in our brush. And we're using that here to establish our first strong highlights. And we're pulling the loader brush first to one side, then trying to already round it a bit, then going to the other side and softening it out while the paint is still wet on the surface. Okay. Picking up more white. And up here we're doing the transition first here to one side of the crevices, and here, because it's diverted into two parts, it's just easier to first add the highlight to one side and later on establish the transition from the other side as well. Just picking up some white and turning the figure around so we have better access here to the surface, and I can pull my brush along the whole element. And continuing here and refining the intensity of our white highlight and but blending it here on the surface. Yeah, that looks already pretty good. And as I said before, we have that cylindrical volume here, and even if that surface here is a little deeper, we still need to add like a highlight in there to emphasize that cylindrical highlight that runs all along the leg. And you can see we're placing actually quite a bit of white here and dragging it down with a little bit more pressure as well on the brush. And as the paint in the back of the brush is also relatively thick, we can still get like a nice smooth and broad blending here, done with that quite a large amount of white. When you work with the loader brush, you gotta be careful that you don't over accentuate one area. But we will refine that bit by bit to get like a nice and harmonic flow here of the details. Loading the brush again with some base color and some white here. And if we look at it here from the side, we can see that we have that raised edge, and it definitely deserves also a highlight on the top. Here, where we have like a slightly different texture with the two small volumes, we're first dabbing the brush a bit, then wiping it off on the hand to actually create like a mixed tone in the brush. And with that mixed tone, we can also like dab a little on the surface to correct our highlight shapes here and there. Loading the brush again also with a bit of the thicker paint actually from the top of the dot of white, and dragging that here over that large muzzle first to one side. And as that muzzle is so large, we're first adding it to one side. Something that you can see quite often with the loader brush is once that I have achieved like a nice mixed tone in the brush, I'm using that same mixed tone on other areas just to detail them out a little. And I'm trying to do the loader brush now to the other side. And you can see, as I didn't use enough white, there is like that slightly darker line in the middle, but while both paints are still wet, I can easily just go back to the palette, grab a bit of white and fill up that spot. And now I'm using that mixed tone in the brush to create like a rounder end of the transition, following that same shape that we find in the muzzle. And as we have that small round volume to the top, we definitely want that to be softened out in the same round shape, and we also want to have that highlight here matching on the top of that bone element. Also want to soft that out to the other side. So our sphere volume here. And we're also using the loader brush to add like an additional highlight here to the raised edge, just directly to the side. And at that stage I want to add also like a premixed highlight tone here on the palette that we can use in a slightly thinner consistency, so maybe a light layer or heavy glaze tone consistency. And we're using that glaze to correct some of the shapes here. And you can see here, even I try to round it out, it doesn't really follow the shape of the muscles. So I'm using some of that light glaze and trying to rework that shape. And also this upper muscle here needs some slight adjustment. By using the same highlight glaze, we also make sure that the volumes over the leg get a bit more equalized, and we reduce those like super strong impacts that are very localized on like a small area from the loader brush, and connect the areas a little bit again. Continuing also with that lighter glaze in the back of the brush, pushing the small highlights again, pushing them like in the center of the highlight, getting it like a brighter core. And this is really balancing a bit back and forth until you're happy with the result. You always have to keep in mind that you have that overall cylindric shape and these separate volumes, and both need to be balanced from their intensity. And here we're working again with a bit of our original base tone and a bit of the pure white to really get that transition from the dark base color to the brightest white highlight. Okay, and you can see that already that little retouching with the glazes here helped to make them match the shape of the muscle or bone armor piece quite a bit better. And we'll continue a little bit here with a mixed tone of the two colors and a bit of white. And we will like rework our brightest highlight here on that large muscle again a bit. And we're using opaque and also slightly brighter paints for that, because of the size of the muscle and its orientation to the light source. We need that whole muscle to be brought up a little bit. We'll continue with the loader brush, establishing the small volumes as well. Working out the shape here as well with the shape of our highlights following the shape of the object. First pushing the contrast with the loader brush and then correcting the shape again using glazes. And you can see with just these 15 minutes of highlight work here on the legs, we already have like a very nice definition of the volumes, but what you can see that the color difference is super striking. So if you remember, we had the same here on the top where it first looked really kind of yellow golden, and now that we start to introduce the color variation, that will help tremendously to really read it like in the same color. Here on the back we have different volumes. We have the sphere-like volumes and this also kind of hard to describe oval volume here. But it's really interesting how these different shapes flow together. And it's kind of interesting also where we have these different shapes meeting. So like the more cylindrical shape of the lower leg here meeting like the sphere-like element to the top of the calf. And yeah, we will start first here with our highlights. And we will start to the back using some of our base tone and some of our pure titanium white. And the question is, where do you want to have the center of your highlight? And I want that here to be definitely on that top corner of our sphere and soft it out here to the side. And I want to have it softened out also in that sphere-like manner. So I'm placing down that white and I'm trying to get almost like a half moon movement with the brush. And here this is also a very good example like how we use multiple loaded brushes on top of each other to actually get like the transition that we want, and also how to increase like the overall brightness of the surface. So you can see this here already is pulled down quite a bit further than before, and we're continuing with like here with a little bit lighter glazes on the surface to bring up the general brightness of the side. Also here towards the lower crack, and we're just having that lighter color in the back of the brush and a bit of white on the tip. I'm continuing here to push the highlight along that separating crack. And with the mixed tone in the brush, I'm trying to get both sides somewhat equally highlighted, but the lower edge being a bit bright. Continuing, picking up a bit more white. And I'm shaping this highlight here, and we're showing this in a speed up because this is really just like tons of little loaded brushes after another. We're really just trying to always highlight the upper element, keeping in mind our general shape, the small volumes, and also our general highlight situation. So as I said before, we want to suggest like a somewhat glossy material, so we need those dark highlights also, especially on the surfaces that are facing upwards. So also here on the upper edges of each of these different volumes on the like raised bits to the side of the armor. Here you can just see very nice like how you can, with just a bit more pressure on the brush, can actually spread the bristles on the surface and pull the color over a larger area. Something when you work with the loaded brush that is really important to play with is actually the pressure that you apply on the brush. I like to do it like that. I'm applying it to the surface and using quite a bit more pressure actually in the beginning of the brush movement, and then reducing the pressure bit by bit. And the more I'm happy with the mixed tone that I've achieved, the less pressure I actually apply on the surface. And yeah, this is really, I think, like a great example how versatile the loaded brush is. You can get all kinds of different shapes worked out, and you have to get used to the effect that for the loaded brush, the distance to the surface and the pressure is changing throughout the brush stroke. Usually when you paint or when you apply a layer of paint, you always try to keep like the same distance from the brush to the surface of the miniature to have like equal application of the paint, especially when you paint freehands, you stabilize yourself with the little finger. But here we really want to have that change in the pressure. So this is something that we definitely have to get used to when we try to get like the perfect little brush done. And also the consistencies of the paint play like a super important role. Okay. So far so good for the first pass of the strong highlight using the loaded brush and just a little bit of glazes. And for the next step we will just have some water in the back of the brush and a bit of pure white on the tip. And we will use that to re-emphasize some of our strongest highlights. And this is nice because we are actually not creating like a mixed tone with a yellow, but we're just creating like a strong pale highlight that really suggests like a glossy surface. Okay, I really like the intensity now compared to the highlights also on the other side of the leg. And yeah, I think the figure now is ready to add some of that greener color variation. That greener bluish color variation that we also find on the other leg to work out the color contrast and also to harmonize it with the other side. Right, for the color variation we're using some of our base tone, mixing that together with some of the model color turquoise and this time also a little bit of black. We're adding also a bit more turquoise, not too much. I've added a bit of black so the color is a bit darker and it's also not all that intense in like the saturation. And we're working with like a heavy glaze consistency, introducing it first like in the strong shadows of these bigger muscles here. Okay, cleaning the brush and continuing for the next step with a bit of an intermediate tone mixed from the Rucksack 10 and the color that we've been using previously. And with that intermediate shade we can just glaze here between the core of our color variation and our more yellow base tone. I'm just adding a tiny bit more of the green here, and this way it's a bit easier to bridge the two tones. Looking at the intensity of the green and also the placement here, I think we still need to do like a little bit of fine-tuning actually to the tone itself, and we want to create like another mixed tone here to the top, just using some of the base color and some of the turquoise to get like a lighter shade as well. And we're applying that glaze actually a little bit broader, and we have to be careful not to stain our highlights here, so I quickly cleaned the brush and I'm kind of like feathering back the glaze in the direction of the shadows so the pigments can gather there and not stain our highlights. And I'm also creating like a blue-gray mixed tone here from that turquoise, some white and also some black to get like a more bluish tint here, like a blue-gray, that we can also add here in those mid-tone areas. And also here again, I'm using a clean brush to feather out the paint here on the area, because I don't want the green areas actually be too dominant and have like a slightly bluish tint to it. It's the same kind of tint that we also find here on the other knee pad area. And I'm also introducing that bluer shade now here on that knee pad, just to get like a feeling for the overall intensity that I want to go for. And as the knee pad is like the area where I've introduced most of the turquoise on the other side of the leg, I kind of use that to guide me where I'm going with, like intensity wise. And I like that blue shade actually quite a bit better than the greener one. And I really like what it does in combination with that yellow ochre tone from the Rucksack Tan. It really balances it nicely and cools it down quite a bit. And I'm also again working a bit back and forth with our base tone, and again push some of the more prominent volumes here. And this way I can also like use that yellowish mid-tone glaze that I create to work over the color variations again, to bind it together and reduce them a bit in their intensity. Okay, cleaning the brush and continuing here with a bit thinner color in the back of the brush, so like a light glaze consistency, and a bit more white in the tip of the brush. We can get like a brighter gradient of a larger surface. Because the paint is thinner in the back of the brush, we create like a thinner glaze that we can just nicely drag over the surface. And we're doing the same step again. You can see like we're actually applying quite a bit of pressure, and the bristles spread, and we get like them nicely to flow over the surface here. Cleaning off the brush and just feathering out that bit of the glaze here to the rest of the muzzle. Continuing with like a white again on the tip of the brush to push some of these highlights here in the center of our cylindrical highlight. Now that we've pushed this highlight, also here our teardrop highlight needs to be quite a bit stronger actually, and I'm again doing that with a little brush. And with that mixed tone, I'm also highlighting like that second volume that we find. It's actually almost like an upside down heart, and we want to have like both sides of these shapes highlighted as well. Correcting and connecting things a little here with a mid-tone glaze. Okay, I think you got where this is going regarding the color variation. I will continue a little with that here on the back, and we'll be back to introduce like a second shadow color to really sharpen the shadows here, and to give quite a bit more depth actually to the muscles as well. Okay, alright, although the color variation isn't fully established, I want to now actually introduce like that second color here for the shadows. And we'll use that opportunity also to do some refining and correcting work here to that crevices in the middle. And for that, we'll first use some of that wildwood together with some of the flesh tears red to get like a warm red brown. And by its own, it's like a heavy glazed consistency. And we're using that to again sharpen out these crevices here, that separation line along the leg. And we're doing that very carefully because we've done quite a bit more highlighting work actually. But I kind of like stained it a little bit here with a little brush. So we're doing some detailing work here because this is super important to get like a really crisp look. I'm using that same kind of glaze to pick out some of these indentations here, those little details that are kind of like holes in the surface. And I'm using that same kind of dark red-brown tone to paint that second layer of bone armor, that deeper layer of internal plates here that I decided to pick out in that dark red-brown tone. Yeah. And continuing here with like picking out some of these hole-like details in the scalp. Also here to the lower side of the leg. And here, even if there's none, I'm just adding one. And while we're here working with those contrast paints, we can just pick a little bit of that pure flesh tears red and add some highlights to those internal structures. And this is also very nice because we can actually just do like a very small loaded brush in here to get like a very small, almost glossy, reflective look and highlights in there. And there's also an end where you where it's not really possible to get like a lot of brush done in a crevice, or like if it's too deep or too small. So also here it really depends on like the accessibility of the area for the loader brush. So we'll see later on for the toes we will just use more like layers to establish the highlights because it's just too tiny. Here, for example, it's a little easier also to go in there back with the mid-tone, mix on the palette, and then push the highlights again a bit. And here also like going for like a very little pure white reflection blended out with that flesh tears red to achieve like a nice looking pink. I like the look of that. And we'll add a bit more brown here to the color that we've used for the recesses to get like a dark red brown that is more on the brown side. And we're also using that as like a heavy glaze. And we're using that here in the areas of maximum shadow. Cleaning the brush again and thinning that down with the water from the back of the brush to get like a light glaze consistency paint, and we're introducing that more broader and more on the surface, and also to some of those deeper shadow areas. And this is not only darkening our shadows, but it also twists our color a little bit and desaturates it overall. And we're also using that glaze here to soft out our maximum shadows that we've just painted using a thicker version of that very same tone. If you take a look at the figure, you can see that with the leg that is painted and the upper torso, there's a slight difference. The lower legs are a little less saturated. That helps us actually to focus a bit more attention to the upper part of the body. So you can see we have a bit more of these stronger saturated, more yellow bits to the top of the figure, and that is just ideal because the eye gets attracted to these slightly more saturated areas and brighter areas as well. The next step, we will detail out these holes that we've just painted, adding a small bit of highlight that we just placed underneath these elements that we've just painted to just push the three-dimensional look of it. And while we're there, we're using that opportunity to also re-establish some of these highlights here along that separation line. And this is actually a good opportunity to clean up the dark lining that we've done. And this step is also super important to get like a really crisp and defined look on a figure, and we really need that here in an area like that. We need that balance of small pronounced highlights and long and large surface blends, and yeah, we're detailing that look here further with first of the more of the dark red brown shadows that we also see here in the upper area of strongest shadow, and then we're back to push the color variation a bit more. Right. As you can see here, the adjustment works are done with a light glaze, and we're using that to push the overall contrast, but also to knock down the overall intensity of that yellow tint from the Rucksack 10. Down here, for these small volumes, we also really want to have like a pronounced and more contrasted look. So we're again applying these maximum shadows and the colors for these dark details here with quite an opaque paint. And in the next step, we're continuing with thinner glaze here to do some softening out work and to get like a slightly smoother transition. Alright, as you can see, I continued here with the glazes of the intermediate tones, and I think here on the back it works already pretty good, but when we turn it to the side you can see that we need a little more defining work. On the front I really like the look already, so let's see what we need to do to really finish an area like that and to really articulate the volumes. Alright, let's zoom in a little for that. So as you can see, the palette is already looking a bit messy, but for like an playful, organic situation that we have here, this is actually not all that bad, because we need loads of intermediate tones. So you can see on the palette we have quite a lot of different intermediate tones going on, but actually it's quite perfect for the glazing work on areas like that or for a stage like that, because we need all those different tones to get like nice intermediate shades. I'm starting here with our yellowish highlight tones, and I'm using the glazes here to kind of re-establish the shapes that we see, and to really try to and this step is really good to kind of clean up the area and to really articulate the different shapes that you find. And especially when you start to detail out an area with like smaller loaded brushes or smaller areas of highlight, like that sphere-like highlight here on the back of the calf, and you also have other shapes to the side of it, you definitely need to do some connecting works, and we're doing that here with glazes. So we have to wait also always with glazes until they are dry, and we're waiting until like that sheen is fading and it looks matte, and then we can continue with like the glazes. I'm also continuing here to the upper part of the thigh, also just making sure that we have like the same colors going on, and also re-emphasizing the shapes that we see. And here in that area you can see we really need to detail out the color variation here. And we did that using a bit more of the contrast color Wildwood, a tiny bit of red, and some for our base tone. And we're also working with like a heavy glaze consistency. And we're using that here to push our maximum shadow a bit. And we're thinning that down in the next step on the palette. And to work more with something like a light or medium glaze tone consistency, because we're working more here on the larger surface, wiping off the brush a bit so we don't have any of the glaze running uncontrolled out of the brush on the surface and staining it. So we can really just apply like a thin film to emphasize our shadows. And you can see like if the consistency of the glaze is perfect, and also you don't have too much of it in the brush, the glaze dries within actually a second or two on the surface, and you can really see from like how it's wet first and then like 2 seconds later it's already matte. And we're continuing here with a bit more blue in the mix, just to connect our color variation of those warm brown shadow color variations and the more bluish color variation to the front of the leg. And we're also using that tone on the other side of the leg to achieve like a similar value here. And we're also using that same tone on the other side of the leg to achieve like a similar value here. Okay, and down here we're continuing again with the loaded brush to connect like the front highlight, and also these to connect these more bone colored areas to the front a little bit with that bluish color variation from the side. Okay, I like that quite a bit more, but I still want to push like the lights here to the side to get like a slightly more paler look again. And I turned the figure around for that. This way I have better access to the surface and I can just pull the loaded brush really all along that shape here. Picking up a bit more white to also reach that lower side here, and then connecting it again with the glaze from the back of the brush. Okay, I like that really quite a bit more, but this area here is kind of really hard to render out like in a good way, because you have all those different shapes and you have that overall connected look of one like soft surface, or it really morphs into each other. So I'm using like an intermediate shade of all the colors that we've been using, and I'm just testing it here on the dilution helper, and the paint appears a bit too thick, so I'm just using a bit of water here from the cup. To create like a thinner version of the paint, and yeah, that's better. And we're working now more with like a light glaze consistency, applying that like neutral tone. And because we have like all the colors from the color variation and also from like the general shadow color in there, we can get like a tone that is just like darkening down our surface without like pushing it to either one direction. And we can use that to connect like the shapes and the shadows again a bit. So that helps us to define the upper areas by the highlights, and we have like this nice and softened out areas in the shadow. Because overall you have like all these different shapes, but it's just connected with like almost a layer of material. So it's a little bit like somewhat in between like bone, skin. So you want to have like the shapes visible, but also a connected look overall. We're continuing again here also with like a highlight glaze of that pale yellowish tone to render out that shape here, and we're also using the same glaze here just to connect things color-wise also to the front of the leg again. And you can see this is really a bit back and forth until we're happy with how the light is placed on the surface and how it's softened out. Okay, using the same tone also on the other leg to make sure that we have like the same color going on. And yeah, I think if you like pay attention to how both legs look at the moment, we have like a very nice color variation going on and very nice pronounced shadows. But yeah, I think we're slowly getting here with our glazes to get like a surface definition, or a definition of the shapes that is adequate for like the hardness of the material. And you can see how I'm really trying to use the glazes here in various areas to bring them together and get like matching intermediate tones on the different areas. Okay, I think you got where this is going. I will just continue a little bit with the color glazes, and we're back to detail out the foot here. All right. As you can see, I continued here with a little softening out work here, and I've said I want to detail out the foot here as a next step, and we're going to zoom in a little for that. And you can see here for the foot I've decided to separate the toes with that inner structure with that dark red brown, and we have these outer plates already in that bone color. The front of the toes will also later on be in that bone color, but because of this small structure here, I decided to first hit them with that red brown, so we can start just with the red bits here of highlight. So we're starting with some of that flesh fierce red again, and some white on the tip to highlight that internal structure here. Need a bit more white. We're pushing our highlights here to really get that almost reflective look that looks kind of wet with those small and pure white highlights. So for these elements here, the load brush still works quite fine, but when it comes to those very small sphere-like elements here between the toes, we have to use layers for that, because that is really not something that you want to attempt with a loaded brush. So with these super small round elements here, we're using that pink from the palette and just adding like small dots here on the surface. And we're also using a bit of pure white on the tip just to like get like a very nice and reflective strong highlight on there. You can see here, I actually twisted the brush slightly to the side because the white wasn't really coming off from the brush. So you can actually use the white from both sides of the brush tip, but if you run out, you have to go back and pick up a little bit more white, especially here for also that bigger toe element. So you just place the white, wipe off the brush a little on the hand and went back in there. And we're continuing with a brighter pink shade from the palette for like these internal small bones of the toe. Just placing like a stronger highlight on there. And also a little here to the front. But here for the caps of our toes, we'll go back and grab some of that bone color. Okay, so far so good. Cleaning the brush and continuing with a bit of our more opaque base color. We're also starting again with like a little brush with a bit of pure white on the tip, and we're first introducing more like a linear transition to the big toe, and now having just like more mixed tone in the brush, we're just placing that as a base color on these smaller toes. There's not really much of like a little brush left, but this is just the mixed tone, and we will go back and grab some white to re-establish some of the highlights and to work out some of these smaller shapes. Picking up the white, just highlighting the edges here of the small toes, and also that like second volume here to the lower side. Cleaning the brush again and continuing with like a bright highlight shade. Also relatively opaque in consistency, and we're using that to work out the highlight situation here on these outer bone elements. First here to that middle volume, and then to that outer raised edge a bit. You can see it's quite nice actually how we just mid-tone and that highlight tone, we already have like quite a nice definition of the shape. We're continuing here with a lot of brushes. Actually a bit more thicker paint from the top of the dot of the white paint here on the surface, and then wiped off the brush on my hand to smooth out like that transition on a very short area, and now using that mixed tone here to blend out the blending to the sides. You can see how important that small edge gets to like really read that shape and to separate it to the sides. And we're first working on these like larger surface blends of the highlight, and we're re-establishing some of those stronger shadows later on. You can see like actually the loader brush dried a little bit too early on the surface, so I'm using thick paint, actually just first dabbing it off here, but then using it again here in that area where the loader brush dried a little too early. And I'm using thicker paint because that covers like that line, that tight mark of the dried paint. And now it already looks a lot finer than before. And we can continue like establishing stronger highlights and detail up these the area here with highlights. It's always important like that when you add a highlight to one edge, that you have like the same kind of highlight also on the edges next to it, so the highlight is always somewhat consecutive. So if you have it hitting that edge like this strongly, you also want to have it to that lower element. We're continuing again also here for that other side. Getting like quite an extreme highlight situation here, and I actually really like the color that we have also here, that bit of color variation where the tone appears a bit more red because it was hit with like the wash from before, but also those warmer color variations actually like add quite a nice twist here to a small detail like the foot, and continuing like with a bit of like a darker color. I like the look of that, but I want to detail some of the shadow areas a bit more, and also add a bit of that warmer color variation. So first adding some of those maximum shadows here. Also here to the side, plenty of shadow to separate those two plates, and connecting the shadow here, followed by intermediate tone to soft out the extreme shadows. And also adding a bit of that greenish color variation tone, and also just placing that here to our mid shadow area. Also here a little to the other side. Picking up some white again to also get these paler greenish highlights on our smaller element of that top armor plate on the foot. And we went slightly out the edge here, so we're going back in there with a bit of that contrast paint, and we're using it again to kind of re-establish that separation line. Checking back on the other foot, how it's actually here reaching the front, because we cannot really see that anymore on that foot plate. But it looks like separated on the other side, so we want to get like the same look for both elements. Okay, cleaning the brush, and detail out things a little bit further with glazes before we're calling things done. And I really like the look of that small detail. And, I think it's really nice and structured. And let's zoom out a little to actually see how it looks together with like the rest of the figure. And I think the level of detail and the intensity really works well. Maybe here in the back you can see we just need to detail things out a little bit more here with like slightly paler and stronger highlights here on those heel-like elements, first to that lower volume and then also along the edge. But with like a complex shape like that, there will always be something where you think like, oh, okay, I need to like, oh, there is another volume. Oh, I want to highlight that. Need to get like this highlight here to separate the elements a bit more. So this is something where you can really go actually crazy with like the application of glazes and play a bit around with it. All right. So this concludes the bone armor of our Katakros, and yeah, I hope you like the look. I think we managed to achieve like a very nice organic look on those bone armor plates. We might do some additional detailing work in the end, but for now I think this looks really good. And yeah, as a next step we will continue with the sash. See you for that.